you can utilize as part of that effort to really talk about your impact on the grid, your impact on carbon emissions. So before I get started, it's my obligation to tell you that I am talking about renewable energy credits and carbon offsets. They are commodities, they are risky. None of what I'm telling you is meant to be taken as trading advice. So please be careful with this. This presentation is meant to be educational about how to actually use these products and what their life cycle is, where they come from and how they fit into an operation. But without further ado, let's get started. So I'm sure everyone here has heard about carbon offsets and RECs. Have any of you actually utilized to retire a REC or a carbon offset in your operation? Oh, phenomenal. We got 2 people. That's great. So you hear about them a lot, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what these terms generally mean when we talk about them in the market. Then I want to talk about how are emissions calculated typically and how these attributes are used in those calculations. And then finally, kind of what the opportunity looks like for a miner and how you guys could utilize these in the best ways possible for your operations. So carbon credits and carbon offsets, broadly speaking, carbon credits are, they're a financial tool, right? And they represent 1 metric ton of carbon emissions or carbon emission equivalent. And when we say the term carbon credits in the market, what we're typically talking about is what's usually referred to as an allowance. So that usually refers to something you would use in a jurisdiction like California, Europe, Quebec that has a cap and trade system. And it represents the right of somebody to emit 1 metric ton of carbon into the atmosphere, right? They cap the system, this many metric tons of carbon, issue these allowances, and now everyone trades them between them to see if you can lower your emissions cheaper, then I'll buy your allowances off of you, and it balances the market out. When we're talking about the voluntary carbon market, typically what people are talking about are carbon offsets, and that's what miners would be using today. So a carbon offset is slightly different. It also represents a metric ton of carbon emissions, but it represents a metric ton of carbon emissions that have been removed or avoided already by someone else. They've been packaged up, and now the rights to claim that removal are being sold to another entity, right? And you can use that to retire against your own emissions to neutralize your carbon emissions that you put into the atmosphere. So that's the difference there, carbon credit versus carbon offset. Everything we'll be talking about really are carbon offsets and the voluntary space. Carbon offsets, where do they come from? I'm sure many people are familiar that you have a variety of projects. They fall into 4 broad categories. You have land use and reforestation, also known as nature-based solutions. These are kind of the premier product out there in the market. A lot of people like them. Part of the use of the carbon offset market typically has been large corporations like your Microsofts and Apples who are making their claims, and they go ahead and they say, look, these are the projects we're supporting. It's the Amazon rainforest and, you know, protecting wetlands in North America, and these make for great stories, so they have a higher value in the marketplace because people are willing to pay more for them. Another type is called energy efficiency. This is where someone has some sort of facility and they're going to increase the efficiency of that facility, have it create fewer emissions, but to pay for that project, they turn those emissions that they reduce into credits that they can sell and someone else can claim to have paid for that. Renewable energy also can create these. This is being phased out, so you should note that over time it is probably unlikely you will get future renewable energy carbon offsets, but you will still get RECs. And then there's carbon capture, which you can put something on top of a facility that exists today, like a refinery, or the holy grail of it all, direct air capture, which is still incredibly expensive and only exists in very small quantities. But that's how carbon offsets are generated. I bring this up because it's an important part of the story of understanding what a carbon offset is. When you pay for a carbon offset, part of what you're paying for is the story that these projects tell, right? So people put up, this is what we support. We support the Amazon rainforest. We support this project that's, you know, rebuilding mangroves in Puerto Rico and helps, you know, go fund a hospital in the area or something like that. That's part of what dictates the pricing. So a nature-based solution is more expensive than an energy efficiency project or a renewable energy project. The other things that will affect price are location. Typically, you can think of it a highly economically developed location, something like the US or Europe. A project there is going to be expensive. Somewhere where it's not as wealthy of an area, it's going to be cheaper. with the exception that any very underdeveloped, like a least developed country, people like to support those projects for obvious reasons, so those are also highly prized. But that's a little bit about how carbon offsets are generated and how people think about the cost of them. But no matter where they come from, all of them represent 1 metric ton of carbon that's either been avoided being put into the atmosphere, or in the case of like carbon capture or planting trees, it might count as a removal, which also has a premium. Moving on to RECs, so renewable energy credits, I think this is an important one to pay attention to for the mining community. Carbon offsets are great, but RECs are actually a very good product for most businesses, particularly anyone whose activity is based around power consumption. This is directly related to everything that you guys deal with. So renewable energy credit represents 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy's production, but it's the rights to the renewable aspect, right? So if you think about the grid, we think about here in Texas, you have a lot of natural gas facilities, probably some coal, a lot of wind, a lot of solar, very little bit of hydro. I heard it doesn't rain here a lot. But all of those facilities, when they put power onto the grid, ultimately an electron is an electron, and no one's tracking that because it's onerous and very, very hard to do. So when you pull power from the grid, it comes from all of those sources effectively. The REC is created alongside that at a renewable facility, and that can be sold from the facility to someone who's using power off of the grid, and when they retire it, now they have the claim to say, I bought the wind power, I bought the solar power, I bought the hydro power, and I've used that by claiming this REC. Also, obviously, from an economic standpoint, it functions to lower the cost of the power for the producer of the renewable energy compared to something that's conventional energy that has higher emissions. That's how they function typically, and they can come from a variety of sources. You obviously have wind and solar, hydro exists. There's a lot of different technologies that can create a REC. Where are these things all placed? So there's a lot of talk in, I think, this space, and I think it's worth noting, utilizing blockchain technology in the carbon offset space, potentially in the REC space. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about these efforts. I'd like to note that from IVC and Blockfills' perspective, we think blockchain technology is obviously great, but it's important to note that as you see those projects out there, all of those projects thus far are layered on top of the ecosystem I'm about to describe. They aren't actually changing this ecosystem, they're just on top of it. So you have independent registries that exist today that are the ones who tell you what the methodology looks like. When I say methodology, that means if we all go collectively buy thousands of acres of the Amazon rainforest and say we're going to protect it, we have to go to a registry for them to say, we'll validate that you're actually doing this. We'll make sure that you have third-party audits to do so. We're also going to tell you how many metric tons of carbon you're actually avoiding, right? Maybe we buy the middle of the Amazon rainforest and they're going to say, well, that's not very at risk. But if I go buy some Amazon rainforest right next to a sugar plantation, well, that's at high risk of being burned down, right? So they're the ones who actually go through and say, this is valid, this is not. They're the arbiters of that. And they're independent, they're nonprofit in the case of carbon offsets. They also are the ones tracking where these things go. So even in these blockchain technologies, ultimately, they're the ones who say, well, they've been put onto that blockchain effort. And when you unwind those from the blockchain, they go back onto this registry, or never left it really, and then are retired. And it's their system that you get some sort of paperwork from that says, I retired this offset, I retired this REC, and this is my claim. So that's why I want to make sure you guys are familiar with this, because no matter what you deal with, whether it's one of the new tokenized versions of this or not, ultimately it's these registries who you're going to be interacting with, or will be interacting with on your behalf, but that's who it's coming from. Some of the names out there, Vera, Gold Standard, they're two of the big ones in the offset space. They're pretty well regarded. They're pretty public. These guys have to be public, right? Their methodologies, their projects are put out there. They want people to comment on them. They want people to understand it. As far as RECs go, there's a lot of familiar names. ERCOT, Regis, which is what is the group WEC, basically the western half of the US, MRETs. These are all entities that are typically tied to the people operating the grid. So they're the ones who can say, this wind farm actually put 1,000 megawatt hours of power onto the grid in the last 2 days, or whatever it is. So independent registries are how you're going to really deal with the market, and they're the ones who issue these and track these, retire these. That's the system that currently exists. I think it's important to note that, everyone's heard about all the discussions going on in Washington around the SEC, how ESG is handled, what claims you're allowed to make, what people are allowed to say. That's all changing, and I think it's something we all should pay attention to. Hopefully, IVC and Blockfills can be a resource for you guys if that starts to impact you or as things start to change. So definitely feel free to reach out to us and talk to us. We hope to be a resource for you that way. But the reason I bring that up and the reason I mention it is if you look at who goes to those meetings, Vera, ERCOT, Regis, those are the people that they talk to about how do you do this? How do you measure these things? How do you track these things? They're not coming to Ronnie, Virissimo and saying, how do you do this? They're going to Vera, right? So the way these guys operate is going to probably have some sort of effect on what happens going forward. Just to recap, voluntary environmental markets, right? These are used by individuals, organizations to lower their emissions or offset their power usage as renewable independently. This is what they chose to do as opposed to a compliance market like you have in California or Europe. They represent the avoidance or reduction of carbon emissions into the atmosphere in the case of offsets. In the case of RECs, they represent the use of a renewable power source. They can be resold multiple times. The point I'm making here is that these are commodities that can get traded around and they can be retired. Retirement is the end of the life cycle of this product. That is how you actually use this product. There's a lot of the people out there who are trying to talk about using these as a token or democratizing this. I don't want to take away from their efforts because I think there's a lot of good things they're doing. But what they're not doing is telling you this is how you actually retire this and make all the claims that you can with these products. Retirement is the end use of this, not investing in purchasing. I can own all the carbon offsets in the world. I don't have the right to anything unless I retire them. And then finally, it's the independent registries that set these standards and track these things. So they're an important part of this ecosystem. Are there any questions about this thus far? No. Oh, yes.
Are you finding that the publicly traded miners are the primary markets for these products?
I think they seem like a fairly obvious one at first because they have a public face and a lot of them seem to have environmental or sustainable goals that are part of their efforts. If you make any claim like that, even though the rules are still being put out there, it's clear that the SEC and other entities are going to start enforcing that you do something about it. If you're going to call yourself sustainable, well, why, how, prove it? So they're an obvious place to start, but I think, I think that the industry as a whole can utilize these, broadly speaking. As I've mentioned, it's a voluntary thing, so it doesn't have to just be because you want to say you're sustainable. You can use it to actually be sustainable. Okay, I'll move on to how carbon emissions are actually calculated. This is called carbon accounting, and this is a pretty straightforward system, but it's not always that obvious. I've heard a couple people talk over the last couple of days, and they've mentioned things like most of the emissions, mining itself doesn't create emissions, it doesn't, but the power used does. And so how do people account for these things? These are the generally accepted kind of process for how you account for emissions, and it's important to understand. So everything in carbon accounting falls into three buckets that we call scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. And the example I like to use for people is a barbecue restaurant, and I finally am in Texas to use this, which is phenomenal. So I think everyone will actually understand what's happening here. But to take the idea of a barbecue restaurant, if you think about it, what they do is they burn wood to cook the meat. That obviously creates carbon emissions from the fire and smoke that's utilized in the cooking process. Then they have a restaurant that's operating. It's got lights. It's got refrigerators. Maybe it's playing music. I don't know. And then finally, they might have some kind of ancillary service like Uber Eats is delivering their food around the neighborhood. Maybe they get their meat trucked in from some food provider. I don't know. They have third-party people who deliver things for them or to them. So if you look at that process again, when a barbecue restaurant burns the wood, that's their activity, right? They're the ones burning the wood. They're the ones who bought it. They're the ones who burned it in their facility. So the emissions associated with that are called scope 1. They're your direct emissions. In the case of running the restaurant, they're buying power off of the grid. And they're using the grid power, which comes to them. They don't have a lot of options typically, right? They have to buy grid power. Most of us do. And so the emissions that are created when they buy that power are still attributed to their activity because they're the ones purchasing and using it, but it comes off of the grid, and so it's called Scope 2 because it's not being done directly by them, but they are directly responsible for those emissions by utilizing that power. And then finally, Scope 3 is all the delivery people. An easy way to think about Scope 3 is anyone who provides you a service, their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are your Scope 3 emissions. So now we talk about the actual attributes, offsets and RECs. How do I use these? Well, if you have Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions of note, like the barbecue restaurant does, if you can't lower those emissions, which is typically hard to do because usually you can't tell your service providers how to operate unless you're huge. And if you're a barbecue restaurant and you start not using wood to smoke things, I don't know if you're going to have a lot of customers left. So you use offsets because that's the only tool that correctly corresponds to the carbon emissions you've put into the atmosphere to actually offset that. But in the case of Scope 2 emissions, you actually have options. You can use RECs or you can use offsets. In the case of offsets, you'll be offsetting the carbon emissions directly, or not directly, but indirectly with the offsets that you purchase. Or with the case of RECs, you'll be replacing the grid power you're using with a renewable energy resource that you've purchased from and you've retired on your behalf. So miners, all of your emissions are basically in Scope 2, right? Which means you have the option of using carbon offsets and RECs. And both of these are phenomenal products. They'll do exactly what you want them to do. There's slight differences between them, but both of them are a completely valid part of a sustainability strategy. The way you would account for them are slightly different. If you're using carbon offsets, you're trying to match the number of offsets you retire to the metric tons of carbon you've actually been responsible for in the atmosphere. The way you would calculate that as a miner, very straightforward. You take the megawatt hours of power that you consumed off of the grid, you can get the carbon emissions associated with the grid power you used. So in Texas, it's about 0.379 metric tons of carbon per megawatt hour produced, which is actually pretty good, slightly below the US average. You guys have a great grid here. And then you just multiply it. So if you use simple numbers, if that's 1,000 megawatt hours of power, 379 metric tons, that's how many carbon offsets you need to retire to say that you are carbon neutral. In the case of RECs, it's even easier. You use 1,000 megawatt hours of power, that's 1,000 RECs you need to retire from a renewable energy source. The last thing I want to close with here is just to give you an example of what this actually costs, because with Blockfills, IVC, we're trying to make sure you not only understand how these are used, but what's a cost-effective way to use it, and then what's the messaging you can put on that. Because there's, again, a lot of the discussion around ESG is about people say we're sustainable, but what does that mean? What am I allowed to say here? And you don't want to go around making claims that aren't really true or that can have holes poked in them. That's not a great way to go about these things. So using a simple example of a miner who has a 10 megawatt system, and I just assumed that they ran for a month, 24 hours a day, we're going to put this calculator online at Blockfills' website, and you're going to be able to go plug this in. But you can go in and say, we're located in Texas, we're located in New York, we're located wherever, and it will have the actual metric tons of carbon associated with that power grid. Anyway, going back to it, so if you have this miner, there's 7,200 megawatt hours of power used here. That means you need to buy 7,200 RECs or 2,685 offsets. In terms of cost, just to kind of show you the different options, I could have probably put a couple different RECs in here, but a zero emission REC, which is hydro, wind, solar. There's a couple other technologies, but those are the big ones you're going to run into that are zero emission technology. Today's price, if you ask me to retire on your behalf, I could do something like $1.30. If you call me tomorrow, it might be $1.50 or it might be $1 because the market's crazy right now. But that's a pretty up-to-date price from this morning. You can see per kilowatt hour, that's about 1/1300 of a cent, which is relatively inexpensive. When you get over to the offsets, a nature-based offset is a premium product. It's much more expensive. So it's going to cost you about a half cent per kilowatt hour to utilize nature-based offsets. If you want to do that and you want to put on your website or whatever it is that you're supporting nature-based solutions, that's a great thing to do. But it's really going to get you the same net effect as using what I'm calling standard offsets, which are any other technology, any other type of project out there. And those are going to cost you much less, about 0.2 of a penny per kilowatt hour. And you can see at the bottom what I've done here is say what the claim is. Typically accepted claims, if you're using renewable energy credits, is that you're 100% renewable. which means that your energy sources have zero emission associated with them. Or if you're using carbon offsets, you're what's called carbon neutral. It's very unlikely you're going to get carbon removal offsets, which would actually be like saying I put a metric ton of carbon into the atmosphere, but then I paid someone else to actually remove it, so I'm net zero. Most of these are actually avoided emissions elsewhere, so you've netted out to zero, but you haven't actually removed it from the atmosphere. I know there's a lot there to digest. I do hope that you guys will reach out and talk to us. Let us know if you have any questions, if there's anything we can help you with. We do want to be able to really work with you guys, make sure you understand what these products are, how you use them, and actually offer them to you to be something that is in your toolkit as you guys go forward with your efforts. And thank you again. Thank you, John. Really appreciate you guys having me here. And it was great meeting all of you that I have met, and I hope I can talk to you guys before I leave here. But after that, are there any other questions? No? All right. Well, then I expect you guys to be letting us know how many recs you need on Monday. No, thank you guys very much, and have a good rest of your stay.